Hello, my name is Sheila Peace, and I'm Professor Emerita of Social Gerontology at the Open University in the School of Health and Wellbeing and Social Care. Although a gerontologist, I am by first discipline a social geographer whose degrees from the 1970s include a PhD that looked at the interaction of older people and their local environment at neighbourhood and community levels, and included people that were living in the care home sector. I was drawn to this area of work, having been a care assistant and ward orderly during my vacations, so I was used to working with older people. But I was unusual for the 1970s because there was no geographical gerontology then, but multidisciplinary social gerontology and environmental gerontology was developing, predominantly in the USA and parts of Europe. So I have almost 50 years of doing research in this field on which I offer some reflections. So if we could move to the first slide. This figure maps out some broad issues, both past and present. I've always been drawn to the multidisciplinary nature of environmental gerontology. And I've been fortunate to learn from psychologists, especially from the USA, and particularly Powell Lawton, who I met in the 1980s when I was an international intern in the States. Powell developed the ecological model of aging and introduced the issue of environmental press with application both inside and outside the home. That work has been used by everyone in this field, and in particular German colleagues Hans Werner Wahl and Frank Oswald, who was with us at the BSG in Liverpool in 2019, and looking at how physical, social, psychological, technological environments merge, and leading to issues around personal belonging, developing place attachment, and issues around agency within environments and comfort and other forms of interaction. So a coming together of psychosocial and also professional practitioners. So I've been influenced by Graham Rolls's work, especially from Prisoners of Space onwards, as a geographer. Sociologists like Jay Bagubrium, anthropologists Bob Rubenstein, and architects Wiseman and more recently Habib Chowdhury, as well as in occupational therapy Susanna Varson, who also was with the BSG in Manchester in 2018. So these are international colleagues, and of course alongside them we have expertise in the UK. And again, I'd want to mention my external examiner, Tony Warnes, and other colleagues such as Tom Scharf and Chris Phillipson, Catherine Hennessy, and Ness Bergholt, Robin Means, Mim Bernard, and the Kiel colleagues, Robin Darton and the PSSRU team, Simon Evans, Alison Cameron, who have been involved in particular forms of housing, and then people like Tina Buffle, who've really developed the age-friendly city model. So my concern, moving down my list, has been with different forms of person-environment interaction, seen as operating at different spatial levels. And I would argue very much global to local, through the impact of things like climate change or urbanization, and local to global in terms of networking, connectivity between person and space. And space, the social construction of which defines place, all concerned with the ways in which this social construction helps us see how, as people age, those issues of space and place change. So the spatiality of aging. Now, I'm going to move on again in my slides here to say that I'm now more likely to take a rather more relational approach to looking at the ways in which how we perceive home, that much used concept, changes or is iterative across the different spaces and places in which we live as we get older. And that can be both at the level of the urban, rural, community level, to where most people live, general housing, to those specialized, more alternative forms of housing, to, at the end of life, the care home sector. And what I've presented here is an accumulation of issues to come from research, an enormous amount of research that I've reviewed in the past few years around these sectors, looking at those cross-cutting issues. And so this brings me to where I'm still trying to compare these findings and look at the relationship between person and context through different social, physical, psychological constructions of space. And this leads to issues that impact on well-being through a number of issues that I raise here. Here I'm particularly concerned around connectivity, which comes from the in particular from the work on the rural-urban differences. Control, spatial control within the environment, how the environment can be adapted or modified and can develop comfort within the home, or also be looked at as a more inclusive form of design for future housing, how that relates to people's autonomy in such spaces. Then, having looked in particular at different forms of more specialized housing, where the terminology is enormous, as many of you will know, to places that become managed by others. So there's a third party alongside people who may be living as a couple or may be living alone. And that level of management and self-management, which I know Melissa will have more to say about. So these issues around living communally and more individualized living are always there. And I'm very concerned also about the way in which, as we come towards the more end of life setting within the care home sector, that we see issues of security and safety and a more regulated environment actually impacting on how we live our lives. And these are the issues that I have raised through having done research in all of these areas over time, and being conscious that when we talk about space and place and later life, we have to look at that internal environment that we consider a part of the essence of ourselves, and the way in which those different levels of space and place relate to each other. So again, that returns me to this more relational issue. And we come to looking at the way in which the individual changes and the context in which they live also changes. And I think that's where I think Melissa probably has some important things to say to us. So I'm going to hand over to you, Melissa.
Thank you, Sheila, for that wonderful talk and introduction to this panel. So I'm Melissa Fernandez, and I am an urban sociologist and a housing researcher, a housing scholar, with backgrounds in gender and women's studies and international development, but also I've been working in various kinds of collaborations, interdisciplinarily in the way that Sheila has discussed, and I've had the pleasure of working with Sheila, an environmental gerontologist, in relation to some of the work that I'm going to be presenting here today. And my work is very much, like Sheila's, centrally concerned with questions of the home, and particularly with the making and the unmaking of homes under different kind of political, social, and geographic contexts. I've been very interested in the meaning of home, or meaning making, and its relationship to materiality. And I'm indebted to many different scholars, colleagues in various fields. I'll just mention a few from human geography, whose work has inspired me greatly: Catherine Brickell, Jane M. Jacobs, the ethnographer Sarah Pink, methodologically speaking. But I was invited here today to say something specifically on alternative housing, my research on co-housing within that, which I've been looking at for over a decade now. Like I said, it's something Sheila and I have worked on together in relation to the development of a specific senior co-housing project called the Older Women's Co-housing Group that some of you may know about. It's quite famous in London. So I'm just going to take a minute to clarify these terms, because I know they can be confusing and mean many different things. Specifically, what I mean by alternative collaborative homes. So collaborative housing, as noted here in the slide, is this kind of umbrella term that encompasses or refers to housing models that can be quite diverse. So it includes co-housing, but also things like community land trusts, housing co-ops, and generally speaking, models of living that include very significant levels of resident participation and self-organization. So it's really, at its core, it's about self-management and control over your own housing environment. And it's that level of control that defined them as so-called alternatives to mainstream housing offer, where there is, typically speaking, very little control. And as these intentional alternatives to the mainstream, they are these very, very rich spaces from where to think about the ways in which housing can be a space from which to challenge and at the same time kind of conform to the so-called typical ways of doing the home, but also typical ways of doing aging, community life, family life, friendships, citizen engagement, mutual aid, and much, much more. And so co-housing specifically, which is what I'm going to be kind of concentrating on now, is a type of collaborative housing model that has been growing a lot in the UK in recent years. It's a little bit more established in Europe, in Australia, in Canada, and in the United States. And it also, of course, involves this very strong form of residential engagement through the various stages of housing provision. What I mean by that is that there is residential engagement all the way from the moment of the design or co-design with architects through to the moment when residents move in, and then, of course, managing the housing space while they live there. Some of its defining features are that it can be intergenerational. So I'm going to be speaking about the senior specific, but there are intergenerational communities like Lancaster Co-housing that some of you might know or perhaps even live there. And it's pictured here in the slide. But then there's the senior specific variant. So the Older Women's Co-housing Group, the Featherstone Group that is pictured here, that I should mention is now defunct, but turned into an intergenerational group later on. And what these senior co-housing models kind of offer are these non-institutional forms of communal aging, in place that can help to prevent dependence on family members or other intermediate options like assisted living or extra care. So they're an alternative, they're a kind of additional option. Another feature of co-housing is that while they are mostly community-led, and the ones I'm going to talk about are community-led, they are also sometimes developer-led, so something like a housing association might be involved in their development. They involve a range of motivations and ideologies. Groups can come together under all kinds of guises and with very different reasons. And our research has shown that, in fact, with senior co-housing, it might not be the age element that attracts people to them. It might be environmental causes, it might be financial reasons, spatial reasons, and really a sense of wanting to control their future in some way that might not be so directly attached to questions of age in the first place anyway. So it really complicates a straightforward understanding of choice and intentionality. Another feature is that this built environment really balances the private and the public space within a scheme, a particular scheme. So they combine a private dwelling with a shared physical space for activities that usually have to do with eating meals together, but they can also be gardens and outside space. And that shared outside space was hugely crucial to this moment that we've just lived in COVID and how these communities managed lockdown restrictions. And I'll say more about that in a minute. Another feature that they can be single or mixed tenure. So they're usually more in the ownership model, but there are also many schemes out there that are mixed tenure. And there are a range of noted benefits around co-housing that people talk about. Essentially, it's expected to enhance the quality of life of those who live there while reducing public costs on things like health costs. It's said to be a more sustainable alternative, both in terms of the environment, but also in terms of its social composition. If it's modeled correctly, then financially, it can also be a more affordable option. It could be more accessible. And it can foster a sense of place, connectivity, and belonging, the kinds of things that Sheila was talking about before, by combating a lot of the alienation and isolation that is often experienced, particularly in older age. And of course, that does not mean that there are not challenges. There are plenty of challenges associated to it. So in particular, there's the kind of time, finance, and commitment and energy that's required to develop these schemes. The commitment that you need when you live there. You have to be able to face and manage conflict. You have to manage change. You have to deal with things like disease and aging and death. There needs to be discussions continuous around questions of care, the boundaries of care, etc. Okay, so I'm going to move on to my next final slide, where I want to just propose 3 ideas around why these so-called very niche alternatives actually matter to our thinking about the present and the future of housing, kind of more broadly. And I'm going to base this on the research that I've been doing over the past 10 years, but also the research that I've done with Sheila and Professor Karen West on the older women's co-housing group, and then more recent projects as well with Karen and some other colleagues at Bristol, at Northumbria, and at the LSE. So back in 2016, when we began to study Ouch, we found there that there are these relations of care in later life that were being redistributed by the women living in this group. And particularly that they practice this model of informal care towards one another that really relies on a sense of interdependence, on a shared sense of interdependence. And of course, the quality of that sharing and the informal modalities of care that then take place in an everyday way, the mutual aid that may emerge, all of those things happen over time, and certainly in relation to the quality and the depth of the personal relationships amongst the neighbors. But what was clear here and in other communities that we've looked at is that individual agency, the sense of agency, autonomy, emancipation that comes from being attached to these groups in older age are integrally tied to collective commitments and to mutual aid. So this is actually a model that fosters independent living in older age, but is grounded paradoxically on interdependence and caring for one another. So that's one of the interesting things around social reproduction and care. that I wanted to raise. The second one is about the relationship that it raises in terms of health and the home in later life. And under the conditions of enforced isolation, like the ones we've just experienced in COVID. So we were able very fortuitously last year to do research into the impacts of collaborative housing and loneliness. And we were doing that research for the Ministry of Housing in the UK here. And then COVID happened, and we were able to then do a further piece of research on the impacts of COVID-19 in these communities. And what both of those pieces of work done together have demonstrated was that these forms of collaborative living and the solidarity that emerged within them can mitigate against the kind of ill health and particularly against the loneliness that might occur in older age in all of its social, emotional, and existential variations. And what many of the communities have or demonstrated was this capacity to very quickly adapt and very efficiently adapt to this crisis, mitigating some of the worst aspects of the lockdown restrictions in terms of isolation and health, etc. So, for example, there were a very quick creation of health bubbles amongst residents, the ability to come up with models of financial aid for one another when those were necessary. There was even a case where they engaged in formal care, which is usually out of the equation for an a neighbor with Alzheimer's. And the reason that this was all possible was because they already had these very strong infrastructures of aid in place to support things like the sharing of resources, cleaning, cooking rotas, performing mutual aid, managing risk in really conscientious ways in their own kind of meetings that they have every month that take everybody into account. So that was already in place there before, right? So it didn't mean that when COVID happened and they had to manage that, it wasn't without problems or conflict, but that there's something really important to be learned about creating solid social and mutual aid infrastructures in non-crisis moments that can generate flexible forms of sociality that can then support the adaptation and the recovery that's really necessary in these moments of crisis in order to counter the loneliness and the kind of related negative health impacts of that. And so finally, then, the third point I wanted to make is about the wider lessons that can be extricated from these models and from co-housing in particular and applied to the more mainstream scenarios of housing. Again, one of the accusations kind of leveled against co-housing is that it's too niche to matter in a sense. And I would counter that, and I would say that while it's true and most residents have agreed in the course of our research that this is a model that can benefit everybody, but isn't really necessarily for everybody, and that it doesn't need to be for everybody, right? The commitments are quite intense, so it's not going to be desirable for everybody or possible, but that the lessons of life within can offer can be supplanted into existing buildings, into existing streets, into existing communities of different kinds, including social housing communities, as a way of kind of retrofitting community or retrofitting co-housing principles and practices, things like mutual aid, shared resources, consensus decision-making into places that are already there. So in thinking about the future of the home, of place and age together, for me, it's not about kind of forcing this model as the best model or the alternative model or the good model. It's an option, no doubt, but I think that it has really important socio-material and political lessons that can be expanded and applied elsewhere in interesting ways. Yeah, Sheila, so I wondered if you could introduce these two figures specifically and maybe talk a little bit around them.
Okay, right. Well, these two figures, and I should do a plug, shouldn't I, here, come from my new book on the environments of aging that will be coming out later this year. The first of these figures really comes from reviewing the research that in all of those areas around the meaning of home that I looked at earlier. And I think actually works quite well also with what Melissa has been talking about, where people choose to live in a co-housing environment that is more self-managed, that has all of those issues that she's just discussed. These are points that come from work across all types of research, where people may or may not choose to move in later life. And obviously, we know that a majority of people are living in mainstream housing. There are more people in later life likely to be either living as a couple or living on their own. They may have little financial resources, maybe low. They may be at the other extreme, living in a large detached house and really need to downsize. And all of those issues are very commonly discussed. And I suppose I was trying here, and it's something that I had been developing with other colleagues, Caroline Holland and Leonie Kelleher in particular, looking at what the point may come when people face an option, or in the main, people will say they want to stay put. They want to stay put in the housing that they know, in the environment and neighborhood they know. They know very little about other alternatives. So there's a whole issue about just information and communication and knowledge. And I think it's fair to say that the issues that Melissa has just been talking about in terms of independence and interdependence, which doesn't necessarily have to be within one setting, but can be within a neighborhood where smaller types of more collective housing for people towards the end of their life might see us with dementia-friendly care in a smaller setting where the community and neighborhood are more part of that interaction with that setting, are certainly things that that I'm very keen to see attempted. I think you were also, Melissa, talking about the balance between the public and the private, and how in co-housing those different bubbles of protected space, in a sense, and neighborliness at a very close proximity were enabled. I was listening recently to a review that's been done, and the Housing Lynn presented it at one of their forums, on extra care housing through the period of the pandemic, and issues around having to withdraw from public spaces into private spaces, and people then finding, of course, they needed things. They needed shopping, they needed online. Okay, there were things that could be done online if people had online facilities, but this sort of interaction between people within those spaces, being able to take some of the activity that they'd been involved in doing internally outside, so using outdoor spaces as well. I think there are a whole series of things to learn, aspects, as we are all finding in relation to living through COVID-19 period, that there are different ways of doing things, and this interdependency between people and amenities and facilities really needs to be taken on board. I mean, the other diagram here is very much the way in which I feel very strongly that the bigger issues, the bigger global issues, are all seen locally, and how we develop our response to them has to start local. but is also global. And the kind of national level of the infrastructure and governmental issues are obviously seated between them. But these are just visual representations of issues that I think are central to us.
Yeah.
I'm sure. Well, over to you again.
Yeah, I mean, I'll just kind of come back on that very briefly, because bringing together your diagrams and what you were just commenting on around interdependence, I think the framework of interdependence is really powerful in this moment, simply because I think if one of the key lessons of COVID-19 has certainly been the need for thinking more interdependently as a kind of global society, right? And so this connection between the global and the local becomes self-evident in this moment in a way that I think possibly wasn't there before. And it's really revealed the multiple vulnerabilities that we all exist in. And I think that for people that are working within the field of aging and gerontology, maybe this question of vulnerability is more present than, people in other fields that, in disability studies, certainly that would be something that's there. But many of the other disciplines we work with aren't so kind of cognizant of the way in which vulnerability impacts daily living and matters to the social and the material, etc. And so I think that vulnerability that we all share, or at least should be aware of in terms of others and the risk that we might pose towards others, that sense of responsibility, interdependence, and kind of justice, health justice even, is a really important thing to think about. And it's one where I think, again, co-housing and collaborative housing communities are really important spaces to think about that kind of conceptually, because like I mentioned, I just think that there are, yes, important lessons there in terms of their actions and their informal models of care that we can all kind of learn from wherever we are living, or whatever option we're kind of going for.
Yes.
Yeah.
And I mean, the other thing that I would want us to be thinking about are, how we define older age. We're talking about 40, 50 years of living, if we want to define things in that way. But, people will argue about well, not argue, but they'll look at the issues around the third age, the baby boomer generation, and issues around the fourth age, where active aging can be just as prevalent, but there are issues around increasing frailty and vulnerability. And going back to Lawton a long time ago, that whole issue of environmental press comes to my mind, and taking it outside of the built environment into the wider community, which we've seen with the work that's started globally with the age-friendly city and community, but obviously has to happen locally. So again, that's an issue which is raised by this diagram. And I think, well, the context is central to environmental gerontology. It's about person-environment interaction, and it'll go on being central. And in a way, I feel very privileged, I think, to have been able to spend such a long time of my academic life doing research in so many of these different areas, and being able to reflect then on not only how we age in place, but also how place influences the very nature of how we can maintain our well-being. So I think I would want to end with that statement.
Yeah, that's wonderful. Thank you, Sheila.